Broadcasting from the Community Service Radio Studio at the Pop Music Academy in Sellersburg, Indiana, welcome to Dangerous Subversive Radio. Prepare to open your mind and question everything. Well, hello, and welcome to Episode 1 of Dangerous Subversive Radio. Why is it dangerous? Why is it subversive? I'll let you know before the end of the show. I have to open this first show by asking the question, how many times are any of us lucky enough to have our fantasy handed to us? Well, I can now count myself among that group. For the last several months, you may have caught my good friends Jackie Smith and Russ Martin and I doing the Community Service Radio podcast. If you haven't caught that, they are all on YouTube. You can look them up and enjoy all of those. During the course of those shows, during the course of our conversations during those shows, evidently, Jackie, my good friend Jackie Smith, whose studio I am sitting in right now,
yay,
that's him, decided that I should have my own show. And here I am. After several weeks of working out the kinks, I'm sitting here doing my own radio show. Yeah, you could draw some parallels to someone whose fantasy is to play pro football being dropped in the middle of the Super Bowl, and there might be something to that, but we're going to roll with it. And it is an internet radio show for now, which means it's not actually going out over the airwaves, but in the foreseeable future, there will actually be an antenna on the side of the building. And from that moment on, it will be real radio. And there are those within the sound of my voice who know what I mean when I say real radio. We are the ones who've driven across the high desert of New Mexico in the middle of the night with nothing but 1 billion stars above us and nothing interrupting the horizon but the silhouette of shiprock in the distance. And it is incredibly beautiful, but also rather lonely because there may not be another living soul within 20 miles of us. But we can reach down, turn that little knob on the dash, or these days push that little button on the dash, and maybe work our way through the static for a few seconds, and then suddenly there is a friendly voice, and you are no longer alone. And that is the magic of radio. Not only radio, but specifically talk radio. And not only specifically talk radio, but AM talk radio. Because like the vinyl records that are coming back after 30 years, AM sounds better. So that's the magic of radio. And let me tell you a little bit about my history with radio. I was raised in Grand Junction, Colorado. When it came time for college, the logical choice was the University of Colorado at Boulder, because my father had lived in Boulder for several years. My sister had lived there with him for a couple of years. So I moved over to Boulder, loaded everything I owned, including my drum set, into a 1969 Volkswagen Beetle and headed over to Boulder to a 2-bedroom condominium on Monroe Drive. And you can guess that necessarily meant that since my sister had a room of her own, I was bunking with Dad. And he was a talk radio listener. He listened to KOA radio, 850 on the AM dial, the 50,000-watt blowtorch of the Rocky Mountain West. And in those days, they had a very distinctive format. In the morning, drive time, they had a show hosted by 2 guys and a woman. And the lineup changed once or twice, but it was always 2 guys and a woman. And they would not only give you the news, they would give you their take on the news. They would banter back and forth, and they were good enough conversationalists that it was like sitting there and listening to 3 friends. During the middle of the day, they would have call-in talk shows. Evening drive time, again, they'd have news, weather, sports, and conversation. Late at night, they actually had a guy who did a show from his home in the foothills above Denver, and you could actually hear his fireplace crackling in the background while he had just carried on a conversation with you. So I grew up, well, not grew up, but during that time, I woke up to friends talking to me on the radio. I fell asleep to friends talking to me on the radio. There was even this guy in the middle of the night who was Art Bell before Art Bell was Art Bell. His name was Rick Barber. I don't know what has happened to any of these people in the intervening years. These days, KO Radio is an iHeart radio station. It's a canned format, and there is nothing special about it at all. But I was hooked for the rest of my life. This show is going to be about politics, and there are several reasons for that. Yes, there are other things in life that I find very interesting. Music is one of my main passions in life. The outdoors, art, just the way people relate to people in general. But the fact is, if you talk about a different thing every week, you never build an audience, and we want to build an audience here. I hope you are soon 100 million strong. Another reason to talk about politics is that it affects your life. Whether you say, I don't care about politics or not, it affects your life. And I'm talking not only about your opinions about politics, but somebody's political opinions have shaped your very perception of the world around you in ways that you may not even realize. And for that reason, it is important to talk about politics. I don't believe that talking about politics has to be adversarial. But I believe that before we talk about politics, we should talk about talking about politics. And we have to ask, why do we do it in the first place? The way we do it is crazy, but why do we do it? Why do we talk about politics? I believe it is nothing short of changing the world for the better. And that is something we all have in common. Mao Zedong wanted to change the world for the better. In that way, he was no different than you and I. The way we're different is that he considered murdering 27 million people to be an acceptable price to pay for building a better world. So what do we want to do? We want to change people's hearts and minds. That's the way we change our world. And we want to change the ratio of conservatives to liberals, or if you're a liberal, you want to change the ratio in favor of liberals. I'm not going to be able to fool anyone for very long. If you listen to more than one episode of this, you're going to find out that I come down on the conservative side. So I'm with the people who want to change the ratio in favor of conservatives. Well, how do we do that? There is really only two ways to do that. Either we're going to change people's minds, or there are some people who say, no, I don't want to change their minds. I don't want to work with them. I want to destroy them. That's fine. Whether your goal is to change their minds or destroy them, there's really only two ways to do that. We're either going to have to kill them or make conservatives out of them. And if you believe that's impossible to do, you may as well hang it up right now. I, for one, do not think it's impossible to do that. So how do we do it? We gather our ideas, we formulate our arguments, we know we're right, we finally get a chance to confront our opponents, and what comes out of our mouths? Something like, you should stop being such a horrible person, you devil incarnate. And by the way, have you stopped beating your wife yet? And then we turn to our ally and say, well, of course he hasn't stopped beating his wife yet, because that's just the kind of guy he is. We all know that. Well, have we achieved our goals? Well, that depends what your real goal was. If your goal is to pat yourself on the back and preach to the choir, yeah, maybe you've achieved your goal. And you know what? I believe that a lot of the big-time conservative talk radio show hosts, I think that's exactly what they're doing. They're preaching to the choir. And I can tell you exactly why. Because preaching to the choir pays very well. If I could make a six-figure income by preaching to the choir, I'd be there. Because me, it's all about making enough money to support my family and putting a little away for retirement. So, if that is your goal, patting yourself on the back, yeah, you've achieved it. If your goal is to actually change the world and change it for the better, you have failed miserably, and you have failed permanently. Because if you come at somebody who's on the fence with that kind of an argument, they're going to get off that fence on the other side. You back people into a corner, they're going to come out fighting. So where did we go wrong? Well, the biggest thing that we wrong was we fell back on the crutch of group identity. What is group identity? Well, it's the notion that because someone I associate with you did something that I don't like, therefore you are a jerk. It is absolutely impossible to support it with any kind of logic, any kind of reason. People keep falling back on it because, well, I believe, because their argument flies apart like a house of cards. The second group identity is taken out of the equation. So the nice thing about group identity is that you are not required to participate. I don't participate in group identity because I am an individual. I am not the white race. I am not the male sex. I am not a political party or a religion. I am one single, solitary individual. I am no one but me. I proudly take responsibility for everything I say, everything I do, everything that results solely from my actions, and everything over which I am given sole control. But that is where my responsibility ends. So if you want me to help you right some great wrong you see in the world, I will do so of my own free will. But if you want me to atone for it, then I'm afraid it is up to you to demonstrate that I personally took place in it. So the downside of this philosophy is that you have to do the same for the other person. One of the hardest things I do is listen with an open mind to people who don't know what they're talking about. We have to do it for two reasons. One, if we don't, we're a hypocrite. Okay? And number two, remember our goal, changing people's hearts and minds. It turns out one does not generally change people's hearts and minds by calling them evil and stupid. So we must recognize the individual. And the next thing we must do is to tell the truth. And however you view the ratio of telling the truth on one side to the other, no one is perfect about it. I have met groups of conservatives who spouted such lies. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that later. And the third thing, or the last thing we must do when we're arguing, if we really do want to achieve that goal, changing people's hearts and minds, is allow your opponent to retreat with dignity. You beat them down to where they've got nothing left to fight with. You haven't won a thing. So in the future episodes, you will find that I am extremely big picture in the way I look at things. I do not know all the names of all 535 members of Congress, much less their voting records. But I do know the role of the executive branch in the Constitution, and that is to make the laws and to appropriate the funds for the executive branch to do the 18 things that they are authorized to do in the Constitution. I'm going to have a list of those for you in the next episode. But so, like, again, big picture. I do not know. I cannot, give you quotes from every Supreme Court case of the last 150 years, but I do know what the Supreme Court is supposed to do, what the role of the judiciary is in our government, and that is to apply the law as it is written. It's not to level the playing field. It's not to make things better for the little guy or the big guy. It's not even to interpret the law, which is what a lot of people think the Supreme Court does. No, their role is to apply the law as it's written. Any law that makes things worse for the little guy or the big guy is a bad law. Any law that can be interpreted in multiple ways is a bad law. You need to get rid of it and get a better one so that the Supreme Court can apply the law. So, if you want to argue about Obamacare and how many people it's supposed to have helped by now, which is 25 million, and how many people it has actually helped by now, which is 10.4 million, I'm not going to argue numbers with you. I'm going to tell you that any law that helps 10 million people by harming 220 million people is a bad law. We need to get rid of it and get a new one. Or in that case, get rid of it and not get a new one. You know, prior to the 1940s, government had almost no role in healthcare whatsoever. Now, let me ask you this. Do you remember your grandparents telling you stories about how before the 1940s, the main driving force in their life was the need to obtain health care? Do you remember hearing, watching documentary films, newsreels about how before the 1940s, people were perishing by the hundreds of thousands because they had no access to a doctor? Do you remember reading encyclopedia articles about how before the 1940s, healthcare was so expensive that only the wealthy could afford it? Yeah, well, neither do I. I wonder why that is. I can only come up with two explanations. One, somebody has gone through every scrap of every form of media for the last 70 years and erased every mention of the problems people had obtaining healthcare, along with erasing that single aspect of their lives from the memories of anyone old enough to remember that time. Or, before that time, obtaining healthcare was not that much of a problem for people. Which do you think is more likely? So, we can look back and we see no government involvement in healthcare, no problems. Government involvement in healthcare, problems. Do you think there might be an explanation in there? So anyhow, like I said, I'm extremely big picture. What the ideas that I'm going to present, the arguments I'm going to make on this show are bigger than any president. They're bigger than any Congress because we, the people, the American people, are bigger than any Congress. We're bigger than any president. There's also going to be no herd mentality here, no matter which herd you're talking about. And I'll give you an example of that. I do the Facebook thing, and I came across a post on Facebook with a little video of the actress Demi Moore kissing a young man who was pretty obviously under 18 years old. And they presented this as proof of how widespread pedophilia is in Hollywood these days. Well, this video was at least 30 years old. Demi Moore was a young woman. She was not much older than the boy she was kissing. And so, let me tell you, this does not really fit the definition of pedophilia. Pedophilia is a sexual preference for prepubescent children. Okay? This did not show what's rampant in Hollywood today. It showed what happened in one house 30 years ago. And when I happened to point these things out, this group of conservatives turned into a mob of villagers with torches and pitchforks coming after me. So, and they called me filthy names. They called me morally bankrupt. So, you see, no one side has a monopoly on the truth. Am I always right? No, I'm not always right. I expect to be wrong about a third of the time. But when I am wrong, I admit it, and I set out to learn where I went wrong. And I can take that little tidbit and put it in the know column instead of the don't know column. So don't think you're going to be able to trip me up that much or that easily. I know I'm not wrong because what we know, what any of us know, is a tiny drop in the bucket of what we don't know. And the way we see the world is inevitably a copy of a copy of a copy, each one a little fuzzier than the one before. There's a rule, the 10,000 hour rule. It applies to music. I've heard it also applies to other fields of endeavor, that it takes 10,000 hours to master any skill. Well, I've spent at least 10,000 hours looking for the original of all those copies. I've become pretty good at it. That's why Jackie Smith chose me for this show, and I think he chose wisely. So I'm looking forward to the future shows. And I'm looking forward to telling you about this. Whoop. You're going to have to bear with me. I got a few slides behind. This, there we go. This is the book, Dangerous Subversive Heresies, by yours truly, Tim Rotalick. Now, I know what you're saying. You're saying, well, he's just using the show to plug his book. Well, duh. You do it too. And besides, I kept you watching for 25 minutes before I even mentioned it. But the reason I mention it is that if my approach to talking about politics intrigues you, this book was written with exactly that philosophy. If you would like some good arguments to start to convert your liberal friends over to your way of thinking, you've tried it before and you've failed. This is a new way to try it. It does not back people into corners. It does not insult people. It does not preach to the choir. It is what I like to call stealth conservatism. You sneak in under their radar. And before they even know it, they're listening to the rational, logical, reasonable arguments for the conservative philosophy. So, it is on Amazon.com, paperback. It is also on Kindle. But I'd really like you to get the paperback for now because the Kindle still needs a couple of revisions to it to make it the quality of product that I want to put before the public. So that's going to wrap it up for episode number 1. I hope you come back next week. I hope you bring some friends. I hope you grow to be 100 million strong. So good night, everybody. See you next week.